It was a normal day when Sarah decided to grab lunch at the McDonald's drive-thru near her home. She had been to that location countless times before, always getting the same order, a Big Mac, fries, and a Coke. But this time, something felt off. There was a strange chill in the air as she pulled into the parking lot, a sensation she couldn't explain. Sarah brushed it off, thinking it was just the weather. She parked her car, glanced at the menu on the drive-thru sign, and rolled down her window to place her order. "Hi, welcome to McDonald's. What can I get for you today?" The voice from the speaker was the usual friendly tone, but Sarah felt a little uneasy, as if something wasn't quite right. "I'll have a Big Mac meal, fries, and a Coke," Sarah said, her usual order. She was trying to push away the feeling that something strange was happening, but the tension in the air was building. "All right, pull up to the second window, please," the voice replied. Sarah made her way to the window, where she was greeted by a young woman with a forced smile. She handed Sarah her food without saying much, which was odd. Usually, the employees were cheerful, but this girl seemed distracted, almost like she was in a hurry to get rid of Sarah. As Sarah took the bag and drove off, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She had no idea that this visit would change everything. She hadn't noticed the man sitting in the corner, watching her with a strange, almost predatory gaze. She didn't see the shadows in the kitchen, the figures moving too quickly to be seen. But the moment she took her first bite, everything would begin to unravel. Sarah's car was parked at a quiet spot in the parking lot, and she sat back, ready to enjoy her meal. She unwrapped the Big Mac and took her first bite, savoring the familiar taste. But as she chewed, something didn't taste quite right. The burger was off. It wasn't the usual perfect combination of flavors. The lettuce was wilted, the sauce was too thick, and the meat had an odd texture. Sarah shrugged it off, assuming it was just an off day for the kitchen. She continued eating, but the strange feeling in her stomach grew stronger. It wasn't just a taste. There was something in the air. A sense of unease settled over her, and she couldn't help but feel like someone was watching her. She glanced around the parking lot but saw no one, just the empty tables and benches near the restaurant. Still, she felt like someone was there, lurking in the shadows. Her hands began to tremble as she reached for her fries, trying to distract herself. But when she looked at the fries, they were different too. The usual golden, crispy texture was gone. Instead, they were limp and soggy, as if they had been sitting under the heat lamp for hours. She frowned and put them aside, deciding to call the restaurant and let them know about the issue. But when she reached for her phone, she realized it wasn't in her bag. Confused, she checked the car's cup holder under the seat and even the glove compartment, but her phone was nowhere to be found. Panic started to rise in her chest. She was sure she had placed it in the passenger seat, but it had vanished without a trace. It wasn't the first time something had disappeared in her car, but the feeling of dread was much stronger this time. Just as Sarah was about to step out of the car and go back into the restaurant, she noticed something strange. The restaurant's windows were all dark, and the lights inside flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The door, which was usually open, was now closed, and there was no sign of life. It was only noon, so why was the place so quiet? Desperately, Sarah got out of the car and made her way toward the entrance of the McDonald's. As she approached, she noticed that the door was locked. She shook it several times, but it didn't budge. Panic set in. Why was the door locked? Why was the restaurant completely deserted? The world around her felt like it was slipping out of focus. She walked around the building, hoping to find another entrance, but every window she peered into was dark. She felt a cold shiver run down her spine. Something was definitely wrong. This McDonald's, a place she had visited so many times before, now felt like a completely different place. Suddenly, Sarah heard a faint sound coming from behind her. It was the faintest of footsteps, the kind you barely notice but that still sent a chill through your bones. She spun around quickly, but there was no one there. The parking lot was still empty, the restaurant still dark. Was she imagining things? Or was there something or someone in the shadows? Sarah tried to stay calm, but her heart was racing. She took one last glance at the locked door, feeling a deep sense of unease. Then, as if on instinct, she turned to leave. But just as she was about to step back into her car, she froze. A figure appeared at the edge of the parking lot, standing motionless in the distance. It was a man, tall and wearing a dark hoodie. She couldn't see his face, but the silhouette was unmistakable. The man was staring directly at her, unmoving, like he was waiting for something. The air around Sarah seemed to thicken, and she felt as though her body was glued to the spot. The figure never moved. Sarah didn't know what to do. She wanted to run, but her legs felt like they were made of stone. She was rooted to the spot, staring at the figure, unsure whether to approach or get back in the car and drive away. The silence between them stretched on for what felt like an eternity, but in that moment, everything seemed to slow down. Then Sarah heard something that made her blood run cold. A voice. It came from nowhere, but it was clear and unmistakable. "Come inside." The voice was soft but urgent, almost a whisper carried by the wind. Sarah couldn't see anyone else, but that voice was real. It was as though someone inside the restaurant had spoken to her directly. The voice wasn't friendly. There was something chilling about it, something that made her spine tingle with fear. Without thinking, Sarah took a few steps back toward her car, her hands trembling. But before she could make it inside, the voice came again, louder this time. "You're not leaving. Not yet." The air grew even colder, and Sarah's heart began to race. She turned quickly and ran to her car, but the figure was gone. There was no trace of him anywhere. Her mind was spinning. What was happening? Why had he disappeared? And why did she feel like she was being pulled into something she didn't understand? Sarah's mind raced as she sped out of the parking lot, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't explain what had happened, but one thing was for certain. She wasn't coming back to this McDonald's again. However, her curiosity gnawed at her. She couldn't just forget about what she had witnessed. She had to know what was going on. A few days later, Sarah found herself back at the same McDonald's. This time, it was evening, and the lights were on. The parking lot was bustling with activity, just as she remembered. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. She decided to walk inside and see if she could find any answers. The moment she entered, the familiar smell of fries and burgers hit her, but something else lingered in the air, a faint odor she couldn't quite place. As she walked to the counter, a worker greeted her with the same forced smile she had seen the last time she was there. "Can I take your order?" the employee asked. Sarah's voice trembled slightly, but she asked for a Big Mac again. She needed to understand what was happening. When she received her food, she sat down at a booth, her eyes scanning the room. There was something hidden here, something that didn't belong. Suddenly, a door at the back of the restaurant caught her attention. It wasn't part of the usual layout. It looked like a service door, locked with a chain. But as Sarah stared at it, she saw something move behind the door, something that shouldn't have been there. Sarah could no longer ignore the urge to investigate. She couldn't let this go. She waited for the right moment. And when the restaurant grew quieter, she made her move. She walked toward the back of the store, her pulse quickening. The door was still locked, but as she approached it, something strange happened. The chain was gone. With a mix of fear and determination, she opened the door. What she found on the other side made her blood run cold. There, in a dimly lit room, were dozens of workers, their faces pale and lifeless. They stood motionless, their eyes staring straight ahead, not blinking, not moving. It was like they were frozen in time. Sarah's heart raced as she realized this wasn't a normal McDonald's. It was a place of darkness, a place where people were trapped. Before she could process what she was seeing, the door slammed shut behind her. The workers' eyes turned to her, and she could feel the weight of their gaze. She was no longer just an observer. She was part of whatever twisted game this place was playing. The door slammed shut behind Sarah, trapping her inside the dark, cold room. She turned around, her breath coming in shallow gasps, her hands trembling as she tried to open the door. But it wouldn't budge. She was stuck in there with the frozen, lifeless workers surrounding her. Their eyes were vacant, yet full of an eerie awareness. A voice echoed from the shadows, chilling and unmistakable. You have a choice to make. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she spun around. The figure from before, the man in the dark hoodie, stepped into view. He had been here all along, watching, waiting for her. His face was still hidden, but his presence was overwhelming. You can join them, become like them, or you can leave. But leaving comes with a price, he said, his voice low and menacing. Sarah didn't know what to do. There was no way out, no escape from the nightmare that had become her reality. She felt like she was suffocating, trapped in a twisted, unexplainable horror. And as the figure advanced toward her, she knew that whatever choice she made, her life would never be the same. The room began to spin, and Sarah's mind reeled. She had entered McDonald's for a simple meal, but now she was fighting for her life in a place where the rules of reality didn't apply. What would happen next? Would she escape, or would she become one of them? Only time would tell. But one thing was certain. Sarah would never forget it. Sarah felt trapped in a nightmare, unsure of what to do next. The figure in the hoodie was closing in on her, his presence suffocating. She backed away, her heart hammering in her chest. The workers stood like statues, their eyes never leaving her, as if they were waiting for her to make a decision. But the choice seemed impossible. How could she possibly make a decision when the reality of the situation didn't even make sense? Join them, the figure repeated, his voice colder this time. You'll become one of us. Live forever in the shadows, working, waiting, existing. Sarah felt a chill run through her. The thought of becoming like the motionless workers, trapped forever in this dark world, was unbearable. But what would the other option cost? She could feel a weight in her chest as the question lingered in the air. She had no way out, no phone to call for help, no way to escape the room with its twisted, lifeless workers. Leave, the figure said, his tone turning sharp, almost like a warning. But you must leave everything behind. Your life, your memories, even your future. The words hit her like a punch to the gut. She didn't understand. How could she leave everything behind? Was this some kind of twisted game, or was this truly her only option? Her mind was clouded with confusion, her thoughts scattered like broken glass. She turned toward the door again, but it was still locked. The chain had reappeared. She reached out for the handle, desperate, her fingers brushing against the cold metal. It didn't move. She pulled harder, trying to force it open, but it was no use. Everything, the figure whispered again. Everything you've known, gone forever. Sarah's breath hitched. The thought of losing everything she had ever known, her family, her friends, her life, seemed impossible. But was it any worse than staying here, becoming like the others? Frozen in time, trapped in a life of endless monotony, the walls seemed to close in around her. The lifeless workers stared at her, their eyes empty, as if they were waiting for her to make her decision. There was a sense of urgency in the air now, a silent pressure. She could feel it pushing down on her, urging her to choose quickly. Sarah's thoughts raced. What kind of price could she possibly pay for her freedom? What would it cost to leave this place? She had no answers, just a growing sense of dread. Every second that passed seemed heavier than the last, the tension tightening around her chest like a vice. Make your choice, the figure said, his voice now dark and cold. It's the only way. Her eyes scanned the room again. The workers were still motionless, their eyes empty and lifeless. They weren't human anymore, not in the way she understood. They had given up their lives, their identities, their futures. And now, they were just shells of what they once were. And yet, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were trying to warn her. That this place wasn't just about food or workers or a simple fast food restaurant. It was something much darker, something older and more sinister. She didn't know why, but she felt an overwhelming sense of danger, a deep, primal fear. And in that moment, she realized that this wasn't just about escaping the room or the workers. This was about her life, her soul, and what would happen if she made the wrong choice. Suddenly, the air around her shifted. The temperature dropped even further, and the walls seemed to close in on her, pressing down with an almost suffocating force. The figure in the hoodie stepped forward, his eyes now visible, black as night, empty like the void. "Are you ready?" he asked. There was no warmth in his voice, just an eerie, hollow tone that made Sarah's skin crawl. She swallowed hard, struggling to breathe. She didn't know what to do, but she knew she couldn't stay here. She couldn't let herself become one of them, trapped lifeless, forever stuck in this strange, twisted place. With a final glance at the locked door, she turned back to the figure. "I choose to leave," she whispered. The moment the words left her mouth, the room seemed to shudder, as if the very walls were reacting to her decision. The workers began to move, but not like normal people. They shuffled forward, their eyes vacant, their expressions frozen, but feel a deep sense of dread as they advanced toward her. The air was thick with an unspoken tension, and she could feel their cold, lifeless eyes boring into her soul. But something was different now. As she backed away, she noticed that the figure in the hoodie had stopped. His expression was unreadable, his dark eyes fixated on her every move. "You think you can leave?" His voice was a low growl, one that seemed to echo throughout the room. "You've already chosen. There's no going back." The realization hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. What had she done? She had thought she was choosing freedom, but now it seemed as though she was trapped even more deeply than before. There was no escape, no way to undo the decision she had made. The workers continued to shuffle toward her, their movements mechanical, like marionettes controlled by some unseen force. But this time, they weren't just walking toward her, they were surrounding her, their eyes locked onto hers, unblinking, unfeeling, as if they were waiting for her to join them. Fear surged through Sarah's veins as she tried to retreat further, her back pressed against the cold, unforgiving wall. But there was no way out, no way to escape the suffocating presence of the workers and the dark figure who had somehow manipulated her into this impossible situation. "You can't leave," the figure repeated, his voice now filled with an unsettling calmness. "You've made your choice, and now you belong to us." A cold, shivering wave washed over Sarah. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. She had thought that by choosing to leave, she would escape this nightmare. But now, it seemed as though she was bound to this place, doomed to become just another lifeless figure in the dark, forever trapped in this twisted McDonald's world. As she stood there, paralyzed by fear, the workers closed in on her, their cold, empty hands reaching for her. Sarah tried to scream, to push them away, but it was no use. Their touch was cold, unyielding, and their eyes, those empty, soulless eyes, filled her with a terror she couldn't even describe. The figure in the hoodie stepped closer, his face now only inches from hers. "You belong to the McDonald's now," he whispered, his voice sending a chill down her spine. There's no escaping the horror. The workers grabbed her arms, pulling her into their circle. Their grip was firm, unrelenting, and it was as though they were trying to pull her into their world, into their endless, lifeless existence. She fought against them, desperate to break free, but it was useless. There was no escaping them, no escaping the fate she had sealed for herself. And then, as quickly as it had started, everything stopped. The room fell silent. The workers froze in place once more, their eyes vacant and unblinking. The figure in the hoodie stood before her, his gaze fixed on her, as though waiting for her to accept her fate. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she looked around, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was this it? Was she truly trapped forever in this nightmare? Had she made the wrong choice? The figure's cold eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment, Sarah could have sworn she saw something flicker in them, a glimmer of something almost human, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. "You've made your choice," the figure said again, his voice devoid of any emotion. "And now, you will be part of the story." Sarah's mind raced. Was this the end? Would she become just another worker, trapped in this endless cycle? Or was there still a way out? She couldn't be sure, but one thing was clear. Whatever happened next, her life would never be the same. The stillness in the room was deafening. Sarah stood there, surrounded by lifeless bodies that were once employees of McDonald's. She could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on her, her mind struggling to make sense of it all. The air was thick with tension, and she could barely move, her body frozen in place by fear. But in the midst of the silence, a new thought began to form in her mind. What if this wasn't the end? What if there was something she could do to escape? She couldn't just give in. She couldn't allow herself to become one of them, trapped in this strange, dark version of the world. The figure in the hoodie watched her closely, his cold eyes never leaving her face. He seemed to sense her internal struggle, as if he was waiting for her to make her move. But what was the right move? There was no clear answer. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by a low, eerie sound, a rustling, almost like whispers in the air. The workers began to move again, their motions jerky and unnatural. Their vacant eyes locked onto Sarah as they shuffled toward her once more, their hands outstretched, ready to drag her into their world. Without thinking, Sarah took a step back, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't let them get to her. Not now. Not when she was so close to finding a way out. But then, something strange happened. As the workers advanced, one of them stopped. It was a woman, dressed in the same dark uniform as the others. But there was something different about her. Her eyes, though hollow and empty, seemed to flicker with a hint of recognition. Like she knew Sarah, like she had been in her position once before. For a moment, Sarah felt a glimmer of hope. Could this woman be different? Could she help her? She took a cautious step toward her, but the moment she did, the woman's vacant expression returned, and she began to shuffle forward again, just like the others. Sarah stopped dead in her tracks. There was no escape. No one was going to help her. The figure in the hoodie stepped forward, his gaze fixed on her. "It's over," he said softly, his voice filled with an unsettling finality. "You've become part of the story. There's no turning back now." Terror gripped Sarah's heart as she realized the horrifying truth. This was her new reality. She had made her choice, and there was no going back. No escape from the nightmare. Sarah's world was consumed by darkness. Time seemed to lose all meaning as she became one of the workers, her life stripped away, replaced by the cold, lifeless existence of those who had come before her. Each day blurred into the next, a never-ending cycle of monotony. She was no longer Sarah, no longer a person. She was just another body in the factory of despair, another soul trapped in the horror of McDonald's. But deep inside her, a flicker of resistance remained. A small part of her refused to give up, refused to accept this fate. Every now and then, in the rare moments of clarity, she would remember the world outside, her family, her friends, her life. But those memories grew fainter and fainter with each passing day, like a distant echo fading into nothing. She had become a part of the story, just like the others. Forever lost in the twisted, endless cycle of McDonald's horror. Forever a worker in the shadows.